Park and Recreation Committee of the City of Wausau. As I mentioned, all of our members are with us, so we're good to go there. If there's any public comment or suggestions at this point, they would be welcome. Don't see anybody that's not already part of the meeting agenda. So we'll be looking at approval of the minutes from our October 4 meeting at Riverside Park. Any suggestions, comments, concerns, or motions? Motion by Watson. Second by Killian to approve those minutes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. We're on a roll. Go right to the item 4, discussion and possible action requiring the donation of Parkland adjacent to Westview Terrace. We had a basic description in our packet, but Ms. Pollock can take it from there.
Yes, thank you. So this is a preliminary discussion. I'm not actually asking for the committee to take any action. There we go. So this is being brought to you tonight for discussion, mainly only in direction for staff. It is it's a different parcel, and it took us a while to figure out who owns it, because when you pull it up on GIS, on the big pie shape, it doesn't have an owner. So I worked with Bill Hebert to find out who owns it, and it's actually the people who own this property are the two in the furthest west condo. And both of them have approached me on wanting to donate this triangle that's in your packet and on the screen to the city for addition to the Westview Terrace Park that is just to the north of there. Their main reasoning for wanting to donate it is just because they can no longer maintain it. It takes them a lot to mow it. They're both I guess they just feel that it's too much for them to maintain at this time, and both of the property owners are agreeing to this. So I did go out there and I did meet with the property owners. They're also working with Bill Hebert to, I think, change their designation from a condo to a duplex or something like that. So that's a different issue. But with that, they're going to get the land surveyed. So I wanted to bring the discussion here to the committee to determine if it's something that we are interested in pursuing further. Because if it is, and if we feel that it's a benefit to the park and to get this additional land, it's about 0.3 of an acre. So it's a sizable lot. And then the homeowners, when they get the land surveyed to go through the process that they're going through with our building inspector, then they would make this a separate parcel. Right now it's not a separate parcel, so it's not something they can even donate to us and give us an accurate idea of what the piece is. They need to get that actually surveyed and separated into a separate parcel. Okay. So this is, when I did go out there, I looked at it. There is a benefit possibly to adding this to the park. It is separated by a creek, so it's not necessarily a contiguous piece of property. But there isn't any sidewalks in this area, and I guess we could put a trail on it from the street. It would still need a curb cut. I mean, there's cost to it, but you could put a trail on, and then eventually like a little boardwalk or a little bridge over the creek in some narrow areas to get them to the park. Really what it would do is maybe shorten the length that the neighbors coming from the south and maybe the west would have to walk along the street in order to get there. But right now they couldn't cross through there because it is too wet. So that's the only real, I guess, advantage that I could see to it. It's something that, we would mow, and I would not take it just to mow it and just for us to maintain it. I think we need to have a use for it and have a reason why we're connecting it to the park. But I guess I wanted to bring it to the committee for initial discussion before the property owners go ahead and actually make it a separate parcel and come to us with a formal. This is, I did give this to the property owners They would like to keep about 60 feet off their property, so this is this is 50 feet. When I made this is what they initially told me. So it'd be a little bit smaller, but this is what they have told me they would like to do. We'll get a final amount once they actually do their survey and make it into a piece of property. So.
Any comments from the committee? Ms. Watson?
So I'm guessing it's probably too small for like a small dog park over there,
Yeah, yeah.
because a third of an acre, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that
it's
sounds-
really small. I think once you would get fencing and stuff in there, you'd have very little.
Okay, because I mean, even if we, like, there was, because you said potentially a bridge or a walkway over the river to the park. Like, it's not like we could sort of take some of that other park to make it a bigger, or it still would just, that river is pretty, is there a lot of water that comes through there? It's a pretty good creek.
I think it gets from what the land property owner said, and I don't know, Mr. Lemon didn't expect to talk about this tonight, but maybe he knows more than I do, but was from the property owners told me, is that like during the spring runoff, that does get quite wet back there and quite a bit of water. When I went out there, it was not a lot of water, but it's the end of the season too right now, so, I don't know if you know anything more about this area than I do. But I do think it gets fairly wet in the spring.
You have any sense of it, Eric?
I do not.
Okay.
I'd have to check with our guys, see if they have any issues down there, and I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. For the benefit of the viewing audience, Mr. Eric there said he didn't have any real handle on the, I guess, the characteristics of the property. Before I recognize any other committee member, I would like to say that I think it would be interesting visually, I think, for people who drive by, if that could be added in a nice-looking little boardwalk or something, I think would be attractive there, and it would be advantage to the people, as Ms. Polly said, living along Silver Spring Street. Kids could walk over there, ride their bikes over there. I think it'd be a nice little addition of that small park. Any other comments from the committee? Hard to say no to Parkland. Okay. Hearing none?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, I don't know, I guess my first impression is it just might be more, trouble than it's worth. There's not really a destination aspect to it. I mean, it could be used as, like you say, access from Silver Spring, but you could always also do that by going around the corner and going into the park. So there would be, expense added to it and not really a whole lot of there to, for us to legitimize taking ownership of it. So my first blush is I'm not too interested.
Okay. Mr. Killian, any thoughts? Your hand ain't up, but
No, it isn't, but I'll chime in, I suppose, just based on comments made by my colleagues. So when Alder Neal talks about maintenance costs and so forth, do we have a handle on what that may be?
I mean, as far as mowing it, it wouldn't be a lot more in our costs, because we already mow the park, so it's a matter of just going there, take a few more minutes. I don't know what the cost of a trail and a small boardwalk would be. We do build those boardwalks in-house. I mean, I would have to check to make sure that we're following any DNR wetland regulations and stuff before we would put that there. So there might be a little bit more to go through that I haven't checked into. But it's a very small section as well that, as far as ongoing maintenance, I don't see a lot of added maintenance to it.
Well, I think perhaps to balance the benefit of acquiring more parkland and some of the benefits of doing that with any surprise costs that may jump out at us, I think it might be helpful to, in the near future, kind of get an estimate on what the incremental costs may be of maintenance. But beyond that, I'd have no objections.
yeah. My thoughts were that some of the land toward the wetter area could be allowed to go natural, but the, like the frontage and the portion that is adjacent to the donors, we probably want to, they would probably want us to mow that rather than let it go natural. So I think we could work something out, so it would be the minimum, the maintenance would be fairly minimum. But I guess we've given Ms. Polly some direction. Do you need anything more? Mr. Larson?
I have to agree with my colleague Alder Neal. If there's a creek involved that, you're gonna have to go back on the road and to get around to cut it and stuff, and I'm just wondering too, with that wetland, how wet is it in the spring? We don't know that, and I'm just kind of wondering, as Alder Neal said, it might be more problem than what it's worth. Thank you.
Very good. Mixed bag.
So I guess I need more of a consensus from the committee as to whether I pursue it any further. Because if I have 3 that don't really feel we should pursue it, then that's what I'll tell the homeowners. Or if we feel that there is consensus to pursue it further, then I'll look into those costs and talk with the homeowners about moving forward with getting a more accurate parcel. But I don't want to have them go through the work of, they have to pay for that survey and getting that parcel into a parcel if we're not interested.
Yeah, that's fair. I personally would be interested in kind of a estimate on how much it would, if we're going to need to do a curb cut and do the boardwalk situation, find out how much it would cost to do that, and then make the decision based on, and estimate on, if you're already there with your mowing equipment, Mr. Larson said, could you come across with your mowing equipment, come across the boardwalk and do it, or would you have to go out on the street and mess around and get at it?
Yeah, most likely we'd come around the corner on the street.
Yeah.
But I can get that information. They just contacted me about a week and a half ago on this, so I said I would put it on the agenda for initial discussion, so I can go back and get some more costs together for it, and we can bring it back to decide if we want to pursue it any further, and see where they're at with that.
Very good. Anything else from the committee? We've given her kind of a general wobbly direction there. Very good. We can move on to number 5, discussion and possible action regarding the remedial action options for Riverside Park soils. We talked last time about kind of the standards that we'd like to see met, but we've got the experts on board with us today, so you want to kick it off any further than that, or should we just hear from them?
The only thing I guess I would add is this is on the agenda at request of the committee from last meeting, talking about the, I guess, the information that was going to be used to get to an action plan. And so I did reach out to Mr. Lemon, and he reached out to Ken and the REI team. So they are here today to answer questions. We weren't quite sure exactly what this committee has the authority to do, but direction would be helpful, and I guess, Eric, if you want to take it from there.
Yeah,
Or
I'll
REI.
let Ken and Matt, kind of take it if you have specific questions and stuff. But, yeah, when I talked to Jamie, I just wasn't quite sure what type of action, so, so maybe if you have questions and stuff for the REI, and then we'll go from there, and, yeah, okay.
Sounds good. You guys could identify yourselves for the record and give us a little overview and kind of what sort of, seemed like you were looking for a little guidance from us.
Ken Lassoff with REI.
Matthew Michalski with REI. So the most recent report that's been submitted to the DNR is the site investigation report, and that's required under Wisconsin Administrative Code NR 716. That is requiring us basically to define the degree and extent of contamination at the site. Better?
You could also drop the mask while you're speaking if you'd like to.
That also works.
Didn't have to ask you twice, huh?
So at this point, in REI's opinion, the degree and extent has been defined adequately to what the DNR usually requires to do. There's 2 locations I know of where we don't have vertical definition, but right now, we're running into issues due to all the rock and concrete that's been buried in those areas, trying to hand dig I've got down to about 24 inches, and that's after half hour to an hour of digging out some pretty big chunks of concrete. So with that site investigation report, the big thing was the DNR with this site requested that we also, so we initially sampled for 17 dioxin furans at this site. There's also a toxic equivalency value that you can calculate, and what that does is take those 17 compounds and make them a single number. So for our initial assessment, the DNR requested that we calculate those values and compare them to the NR 720 standard for TCDD, which is generally considered the most toxic of the compounds. So we did those calculations, but also then compared them to the NR 720 individual standards for each compound. And also with the 720, there is a cumulative calculation for cumulative effect for all the compounds sampled for. So with the report, we submitted it. We gave them the data both for the individual compounds. And in our site investigation report, that would be figure 7, shows the degree and extent based on those values. And then we also provided them with what the TEQ values came out to be. And those were figures 10 and 11. Those I broke down into really shallow, top 6 inches of soil, and deeper than 6 inches. So 6 inches to 2 feet. In the DNR's realm, anything within the top 4 feet is a direct contact issue. So in reality, the shallow, deep maps, it's mute. They would both be considered direct contact issues.
You went, it's 4 feet deep?
Yeah, the top 4 feet of the soil column is considered your direct
Oh, my.
contact zone.
Okay.
So based on those values, looking at the NR 720 code and the individual compounds, there were 25 out of 74 samples collected that showed exceedances of the non-industrial direct contact standards. When you get to the TEQ values, it gets a little more complicated because when you look at standards for that, the EPA for their preliminary cleanup for residential soils uses a 1,000 parts per trillion standard. And then also the EPA, another agency with the EPA uses 50 parts per trillion, and the DNR was initially asking us to assess compared to 4.82 parts per trillion. So it gives us a pretty big range of potential values to be comparing these calculated TEQ values to. But as I said, our main recommendation was to use the 720 standards for the individual compounds. And then we submitted that report with a review fee that's required under NR 794. And that requires the DNR to give us a formal response on the completeness of the report. And then in the conclusion, I also requested if they were going to require the TEQ values to be used, to give us a value to compare those two. So going forward, there's no question of if we've got definition or not.
Okay.
If I could add to that,
A little
normally,
closer to the mic, sir.
if you submit a report to the DNR, they don't necessarily respond formally unless you pay a fee to get them to respond. So that's why we went down that road. So they would have to formally respond and tell you what their position is right now versus going further down the road and then saying, oh, we think this or that. So they will have to come forward with a formal written response to determine, yes, we agree, it is defined or it is not defined, and which way they would like to go.
So we're still waiting for that?
That is correct. That was submitted.
September 15th, they usually try and do a 60-day turnaround. So looking at mid-November. Next step after that would be for REI to develop a remedial action options report where we look at costs and options for remedial actions. So whether that being excavating it, capping it, what all those options are.
Okay, so as far as you guys are concerned, are you looking for some guidance or direction from us today, or are we going to wait until the latest DNR stuff comes back?
That is correct. We'd be waiting.
We'd be waiting for the DNR's formal response because there too before we can really develop the remedial action options report, we need to know what standards they're gonna hold us to. If they're gonna
Okay.
use those TEQ values or not, because that may make a very large difference in remedial action options.
Okay. And then, the committee members can also ask any questions they have, but one of the things that struck me was the high number of exceedances, and I'm wondering if that means that, boy, things are really lousy down there, or does it mean that we really zoomed in on the problem areas and we are now, we really know we're doing the sampling on the areas most likely to be contaminated?
Yeah, so our initial sampling was a lot more broad, and then after that, any additional sampling, we were working on focusing into those areas where we had exceedances. So there's not a grid across the park. We were mainly focusing in areas where we had exceedances, trying to define exactly how far out it went.
So we're zoomed in on the areas that are most likely to give us a high percentage of hits, right?
Yeah.
Send the meter sailing. Any committee members, questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it was, I'm really glad to hear that you did pay to get the DNR's formal response. That seems to make a lot of sense. And I'm also glad it sounds like that you'll want to probably use the NR 720 non-industrial RCLs to define the area of future remediation. Is that correct? That would be your preference at this point?
Yes, and that would be what's shown on the map currently, the figure 7 with the blue outline.
I think that also makes the most sense, and I think Wisconsin has protective standards in that regard. And I guess if it came down to TEQ, and I guess we won't know until the DNR responds, but I think, it becomes a little less subjective perhaps than it looks like. And I think if it came to TEQ, we'd want to hold the DNR accountable for their own standards. And so yes, the EPA and ATSDR perhaps have TEQ standards, but in Wisconsin, we have our own state regulatory standards. And so could you tell them, tell my colleagues what the E stands for in TEQ?
So it's a equivalency factor or value. So it's pretty much the toxic equivalency factors. Those are applied to each individual compound, and they are pretty much the value to try and compare it to. In most dioxins, you compare it to TCDD, and it's making assumptions that the response curve of when humans or animals are ingest this material are a similar shape and are scalable. So there's some estimation within that, and then also what compounds are all sampled for. You can have more compounds included within these that have TEF values, and then your equivalency number would show that.
So with the E in equivalency, I mean, based on equivalence, I think most would come to determine that equivalence means kind of equal or equivalent in value or impact. And you mentioned TCDD, that it was in equivalence with the 2378 TCDD. What's the Wisconsin standard on that? Is it 4.82 parts per trillion?
Yes, that's the standard for the TCDD individually.
So as the older person for that area, so when we're dealing with equivalence, I take it to be equivalent by definition. And since the state already has a limit for what it is equivalent to, the TCDD at 4.82 parts per trillion, if they would surprisingly go down the TEQ route, I would like to make sure that we do not go outside of Wisconsin regulatory standards. And another reason I feel that way is, and I feel for you on some of these assessments, because I think dioxin and furan's rather exotic. You don't see that every day on every site, but historically the DNR has worked with TEQs on groundwater standards, and interestingly, they've always said in their internal communications that the standard would apply to both TEQ and TCDD individually. Now, that was groundwater, but I think to keep it logical and legitimate for the state standards, if they would go down that TEQ route, which would seem kind of odd, I think, but if they did, would like to make sure it's consistent with the state's TCDD level. So that was where I think the little question and confusion arose, was just on the TEQ aspect.
Mr. Chair, if I recall correctly too, this was requested to be on as an actionable item because of what you just mentioned of the confusion, but of the ability for the committee to maybe, if we had a voice at all, make a recommendation that the state standards are used rather than the TEQ values, right? Is what I recall from being why it's on the agenda today.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at, but now that we're still waiting for some more from the DNR, I don't know if an action today would be appropriate. Do have another question. Somebody has a motion, they can make it, but the report mentioned runoff from sites, the industrial sites, parcels on the other side of the railroad tracks, but it also mentioned the aerial deposition that took place there. Do we have any handle on where this stuff in these locations came from, if that's from runoff from those former industrial sites, or if it's from aerial deposition, or a little of each?
So in the report where it talked about the aerial deposition, that was discussing kind of how the site started. So as part of the Waleco site, they did an investigation on aerial deposition, did sampling inside and outside where they should have historically wind patterns would have caused deposition. And samples they took within the rail corridor that is now part of the park showed exceedances, and that's what led to the DNR submitting an RP letter to the city, because that was determined to be outside of that aerial deposition path, but also showed exceedances for dioxins. And as far as the fluvial deposition, where we're getting our highest concentrations are on the inlet and outlet of a short culvert that goes underneath the railroad tracks inside the park. So I guess kind of looking at it, and then it's in a little gully going down the ravine into the park are our higher concentrations.
So it's like stormwater runoff that carried the crud from across the tracks?
Yeah. As
Okay.
far as exactly where that culvert all was being fed from, that's hard to determine now, because in the last, I don't know when that pond got put in,
It's changed over time.
yeah, there's been significant modification to the landscape that you can't really just stand out there and kind of see where flow would have come into that culvert anymore.
Yeah. So it's the committee's wish. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just on that line of questioning. So, yeah, 3M now has a retention pond there, right? You're saying maybe in the last 15, 20 years that was put in. The culvert inlet. So why was that retention pond put in there? Was that put in to replace stormwater accumulation that may have been going east through the culvert?
Yeah,
That's outside.
not sure on that, wasn't involved in it. That's been here since I moved to Wausau.
That's outside of our investigation. Our investigation was for the park property. If you start going off the park, that would be something beyond where we're at right now, and the history of the adjacent parcel.
I'm just pondering on history here. So that pond, if I'm not mistaken, was put in 2004, the retention pond in 3M. So the aerial deposition study, that was very interesting, because I think historically we didn't see that volume of soil samples in the neighborhood until that deposition study really bumped up the number of samples we had. And what was very interesting about that is that a lot of those samples, when you look at the TEQ in the neighborhood, were in low single digits, some of them below 1, right? And if I'm not mistaken, they took tens of samples, and they still could not come up with a TEQ that was more than we found in the park. I think one of the, you mentioned the TCDD, that kind of using that as a TEQ limit level, that's a little bit over 4. And just for the chair and public's awareness, we found one at 108. So that's about 25 times higher than the state standard for TCDD when you're looking at TEQ. So yes, less than the EPA's action level of a part per billion, but looking at the values in the neighborhood, quite high indeed. In fact, other than the Waleco site, I'm not aware of any non-industrial property where a TEQ level in Wausau has been taken that high. So just to give, I guess, some relative context, and so yes, I guess that was outside of the scope, but it does raise one pragmatic, practical question as the older person in that area. So we've got that culvert, and not only is it immediately kind of east of where that industrial land had been and the retention pond, but the distance is in quite close proximity, that culvert, to some residential backyards. So I can understand the practical limitation of your efforts and what you were tasked to do, but just, I guess, from a logical standpoint and from where we're seeing some of these exceedances, what is your professional opinion then? Is it that it kind of just fortuitously stops at their property line? Is that the conclusion?
You're talking about going upstream, so to speak.
Well, 1 yard is kind of at the same level, at least the one, let's see, immediately east of the 3M property. That's about, I don't know, what would you say, 10 yards south of the culvert, maybe? Yards as in a measuring unit. Very close. So I guess the only reason I would wonder about source attribution wouldn't necessarily being for some retroactive punitive component, but for the pragmatic component of when you have a regulatory exceedance that close to a resident's backyard, at what point do you take a closer look at that? Are you comfortable in your professional opinion that we've defined the extent and that it does not go on to citizens' private property there?
When the DNR reviews that report, I think you can look at that and see that it is most likely, I think we both agree on this, some kind of runoff event historically that brought that material into the park. Now, what activities happened upstream, you know a lot of that history as well. So we will see what DNR's opinion is, if there's additional sampling needed to their satisfaction, to protect the public.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I guess we do have a time constraint, but I think we're doing all right. Wondering how soon it would be before you guys are going to have a recommendation as far as what sort of remediation is called for here?
Well, probably mid-November was when we would probably have a response from DNR. So sometime after that, when we know what standards and how, and if they believe it is adequately defined then or not, then we can go to the next step.
So is the DNR at that point going to say you need to take 3 feet of soil out of this spot, and this spot, and this spot, or how does that work?
No, they are going to agree that it is defined or not, or if they want additional sampling, vertically or horizontally, would be the first question that they would answer. And if they accept it that it is defined, they would, then the extent is defined in their opinion. And like Matt had indicated, we're trying to also get them to respond to the question of the standards in writing, formally.
Yeah.
So Mr. Matt Thompson and others in the DNR will be reviewing this and providing a written response, and I'm sure you've had some conversations with the cities, your opinion of what direction you'd like him to go.
Yes, if I may, just as Mr. Lassa said, and for for the committee's benefit, I did, not knowing what the time frame was going to be since the last meeting, I did send Mr. Thompson a communication, just as the older person, stating that I'd be most comfortable if state standards were used.
Very good. So suspense continues. Any other comments or questions from the committee? I guess we're continuing on step 17 of wait and see. Very good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Very good. Forging on. We have educational items from Ms. Polly,
Yes.
including this Assembly Bill 604 that we're just going to get a,
Yep, I'm just gonna give an update of that first. I'll do the park updates. We had very minimal park updates this month. We're still working on, we had, as I think we had mentioned, we had 17 memorial benches between the city and the county this year to put in. So we're still working on those, and playground restoration. We did have some vandalism to some of the concrete pads that we poured with kids writing their names in them that we have to redo. So, that's been reported, but we're working on replacing those. And you saw that it snowed a little bit today, so we're already working on, or we have been working on all the winterization of all of our restrooms and water facilities for the year. So that's getting ready for the winter. And then Sylvan Tubing Hill water system, we upgraded the booster pump, and we're working on getting that. We had a second snow gun that we purchased last year. So hopefully we can make snow faster, even if the temperatures don't, or the weather doesn't cooperate. Like last year, it took us 54 days to make snow. We're hoping with 2 guns, it'll take us less than that, even with unfavorable conditions. If we have favorable conditions, it's done in no time. We continue to work on the ADA upgrades, and then the open air shelter at Oak Island is being replaced. We did some new roofing on there and some panels. I'm going to also be applying for a few grants in pertaining to the skate park, with some of the federal money that is available for improvements in tourism and the ARPA funds we're looking at. So those grants are due within the next week. And then just regular routine maintenance. So that's kind of our updates for parks. And then I wanted to provide, this is just something that we've been watching. It's been moving fairly quickly, and I did bring it up to in our staff meeting this last week, just to let the mayor and the police chief, I guess, become aware of it. But this Assembly Bill 604, I wanted to put as an update, that's a link to it on that. If you go online, you'll be able to click on that link and it takes you right to that. It was presented, and there's been 2 amendments to it so far. But basically, one of the big things, this is one bill of many being sent through the House right now. The Senate bill, I do not believe, has been introduced yet. That's the companion bill to it. But one of the significant parts of this is that the Department of Administration has the authority to designate public property as temporary shelters, where they would allow people to set up camp in a public facility. So when I first put this on the agenda, it was, the Second Amendment hadn't gone through. It was voted on October 27th, so just late last week, and the Second Amendment came through, which does not allow them to use the city public parks or fairgrounds. So that, I guess, is a good amendment to that. Maybe, I guess it depends on your opinion. But that is something that came along in the Second Amendment. So they are still looking, they're doing a number of initiatives to try to work with the homeless crisis and families, and trying to get them work and get them housing. So it's a very good thing. And this is just one of those ways of doing it. But it was very confusing, and not a lot of dialogue back and forth about what they would designate as a public facility to allow tents and camping and stuff to be set up in. So that was one of the things we were watching. But this is the new amendment that they did take out, other than county fairgrounds and public parks that are owned, leased, or occupied by a state agency. So those, the other First Amendment actually also did not allow the DOJ to designate a public facility in a municipality or county, I believe, or government agency without the permission of that agency. So that was another caveat to it. So, but there's a thing in there where if the community petitions that agency and the agency doesn't respond, then the Department of Administration can designate those public spaces for this temporary use. So it's
Right.
kind of an evolving, this whole package is evolving daily. I know that this isn't the only one. I think there's a couple other things that pertain to the city that we've been watching. So I just wanted to keep you aware that this is out there and being discussed.
Very good. Any questions or comments on that? Seeing none, kayak launch?
That will be, the kayak launch will be for the next meeting. That's an update I still need to put together for the committee.
Okay. So I would ask if there are any other agenda items that you know of now that you would like to have addressed at our next meeting? Yes, ma'am.
I know I sent an email about potential of a dog park up by over the water treatment plant. I'm not sure if we have enough land up over there. But I guess I would love to start a discussion of having another dog park somewhere in the northern side of Wausau. So either on the northeast or northwest. And I don't know if there's something, like if we have an existing park that we can repurpose some of it. Or, I don't know. I just would like to see a discussion to maybe have one up north. Is that
Fine with
possible?
me.
Well,
Mayor is squirming in her seat.
I think that's an interesting discussion point, and I would love to investigate that further.
So is the mayor's office going to look into that? Or would you like staff to do that?
We can maybe collab on it. I'm looking at two people who I think could maybe help.
well, if I could suggest, we have a dog park subcommittee. And before they found this one down here, there was a lot of work done on possible locations. And they had looked at a number. I think it might be worthwhile getting the subcommittee back together and talking about those previous locations and where they are. We can always bring other ideas, but I know that a lot of extensive work was done a few years ago prior to me coming about locations, and we ended up with where we're at because those other ones weren't viable or there wasn't enough property. So that may be the case. The other thing is we still have the location possibly underneath the highways that would be like a summer-only use. My next step there was going to be to try to get an estimate on what fencing would cost, because that is a cost that would have to be to the city to see if that would be, no matter what, you have to put fencing in, no matter where you go. So I don't know if that's still an option, but I guess I would recommend as staff to defer it to that subcommittee who had been
I think
working on it.
that'd be great, yeah,
And then when they have enough information to come back to the committee.
yeah. Yeah, I would like to see us continue to work on that one south of the old Menards. But I do remember that there was some property that was offered to us. I don't know if it was going to be free or cheap. It was up on the northwest side, but the accessibility was really goofy, where you had to drive way up here and then come back down here. And so opted not to pursue that, but the subcommittee might feel more warm about it at this point, but I think it'd be a great idea to crank that subcommittee up again and see if they're willing to take a few more swings at the ball. So, very good. More dog parks. We love it. Very good. Yes, ma'am.
I had a quick question too. I know a couple, 2-3 meetings ago, we talked about a structure that was going to be on Parker Stewart Island. Has there been any updates on like what we talked about or any of the designs you had put out there? Or just sort of in holding
Yeah,
pattern?
it was the two designs. Our next step, after this committee where we got the feedback that the island really wasn't a desirable place for it, we did meet with the Historical Society and the member of WPS to kind of talk about where we were at with that and get their opinion on whether or not, one of the things we wanted to know is because only 30% of those timbers are viable to reuse just for aesthetic purposes, it's not ability to rebuild it, whether or not that would be considered historic. And they did say yes, if we have any of that in there, it would be considered historic. So the next step that we're working on now is the executive director of the Historical Society was actually going to meet with the Community Foundation because originally, I believe, when this building was taken down, they had worked together on the potential of where it could go, and she was going to meet with the new executive director of that to see if he was still interested in it, and then come back to us. I think that she was also going to meet with the WAS group to potentially see if it was something that they'd be interested in incorporating into that development of the mall, or even in future ideas along with city planning of the South Riverfront, kind of that farmer's market idea that had been brought up once. So that's where it's at right now. It's still in the air, I guess. We just don't know, have a location for it, but I think we need to determine if all parties who are interested in pursuing this are still interested, then we need to make a determination about the timbers so we can get them out of the storage area that they're in and just keep the usable ones, and then where we're going to store those for the potential of where this would be built. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. Very good. Hearing nothing else, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Ms. Watson, second by Mr. Larson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Another meeting in the books.